And I now ask the four rapporteurs from our panels to please join me to the stage. They will be delivering key conclusions and remarks from the panels that they are reporting on. We will get started with Lina from Bellona Europe, then carrying on to Chris from Negative Emissions Platform, Sam from Carbon Market Watch, and finally with Rachel from Oxford Net Zero. Lina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for coming today, and of course for having us from Bellona as well. I'll try to keep it relatively short. I know we're running a bit over time. So I am the rapporteur for the panel looking into funding. And I think it was pretty clear already from the first Slido that funding here is very crucial. It's one of the issues or areas that I think most of us are looking into. What I find interesting also when we talk about funding, and which the panel also reflected, is the different ways in which we look at this concept we call funding. Because of course we talk about public funding opportunities, public funding mechanisms, but we also talk about mobilizing private capital and the need for a regulatory approach that reduces, for example, uncertainties. Here, of course, this strategy. And I think we could see that also on the Slido. Some people were mentioning a business case. Some people were talking about Horizon money. So there's lots of different things here. And I think it's crucial that we keep that in mind when we are looking into the topic. Because in fact, when we are looking into especially research, into also R&D, when we look into deployment as well, we have to remember that this is not necessarily an area where there is one size fits all approach. And one of the things that was mentioned in particular was that due to the kind of fragmentation in different funding and potential lack of coordination, we are not sufficiently taking advantage of the lessons learned across different funding approaches into different kinds of projects. And this is actually making up a barrier for us moving ahead. I think this is a very important point to keep in mind. And another point to keep in mind here is, of course, that we need to look into also the systems approach when we are looking into CDR. We have to remember the infrastructure needs, both when it comes to renewables and when it comes to CO2 transport and storage, for example, underlying what is necessitated for CDR technology in particular. And we need to make sure when we are looking into CDR technology that we define exactly what role different technologies can play. And I think that also reflects the previous speaker, who was a very passionate keynote that we just heard as well. We do not want to overstate or understate the role of CDR here. One thing that we have seen, and one thing that was also mentioned in the panel, is of course also conflation of terms. I think this goes to the heart here. There is still a lot of unknowns. There is still a lot of uncertainty of the role of CDR. And I think that what we need to make sure here is that we really also in the industrial carbon management strategy or the 2040 climate target impact assessment, that we go in and really make sure that we are reducing this conflation of terms and ensuring more research into where we need what kind of technologies and deployment of projects. Here in particular, we actually have a piece right now on the Bellona website on the conflation of terms and the need for clarity. So I hope you all take the opportunity to have a look at that. But in general, I think what we concluded on, and I'm happy it's recorded so everyone can go in and also have an additional look at the session. But what we concluded on is that there is definitely a need for coordination. There is definitely a need for a strategy, which is what has been proposed today. And, excuse me, that as part of this, one of the crucial things that we have to work on is one of the kind of particular characteristics of Europe, which is, of course, that we are fragmented. More so than perhaps if we compare it to the United States, for example. We have different languages, different approaches, different geographies, and we need a strategy maybe more than anyone to remain competitive in this field. And we need to make sure that this research that we want to do, in particular when it comes to public funding, is not only focused on, for example, R&D and the start of projects. It's also focused on how do we actually regulate these kind of markets? How do we avoid, as we heard earlier, moral hazard risks? And how do we ensure the correct role to be played in the right scenarios? So here, I think maybe on a final note to say that we need to make sure that we are researching also across the development of CDR and across different scenarios, that we don't only focus on the technical bit, although that is crucial also for efficiency gains.
Hello, so I'm Chris Sherwood, Secretary General of the Negative Emissions Platform, which is the trade association for the CDR industry. And I'm reporting back on the other panel that was in the first parallel session, which was about the toolkit that the European Union has to stimulate demand for carbon removals. We had Sven Clement, who is a Luxembourgish MP, Sabine Frank from Carbon Market Watch, the NGO, Paolo Piferetti from Carbon X, which is a company that supports buyers of CDR to find the right supply, and Alexandre Pacaud, the director from the European Commission, with Sylvain Delers from Carbon Gap Moderating. The main topics that were discussed in terms of kind of broad headlines were whether the bottleneck was truly supply or demand, and then also deployment incentives and what the goals of those deployment incentives might be. I would pick out the following key themes for you as topics for discussion which were raised. So first of all, there didn't seem to be a clear consensus as to whether supply or demand were the key bottlenecks. There was quite a lot of discussion of the importance of Europe moving ahead on CDR for competitiveness reasons, particularly in relation to other regions of the world, and also the export potential that Europe has with regards to carbon removals. There was quite a bit of discussion about CDR's role in reaching net zero, not in going beyond net zero, which of course is quite clear, but what is CDR's role in reaching net zero? And I think lack of consensus and some uncertainty around that. There were discussions on the importance of trust and credibility for the sector and of developing good governance, including monitoring, reporting, and verification. Another big theme was the question of technology neutrality, or the importance of a portfolio approach, or diversity of methods, or whichever term you want to use for that. I know technology neutrality has been criticized recently as a term, but generally the importance of making sure that Europe doesn't just put money into 2 or 3 methods, but looks much more broadly. And then another important theme was the importance of defining very clearly how you can use carbon removal credits. And then 2 final ones. So first of all, the challenges around the clarity for investors in terms of creating an investment case. Why would you pay for carbon removals, or why would you invest in carbon removals today? Not yet clear from a kind of an investor perspective, because of a lack of market signals coming from political leadership. And lastly, also the fact that there will be some significant human resource needs that the sector has, which are not yet appreciated and addressed. If I can summarize the key messages of the panelists, panelist by panelist. First of all, I think Sven Clement, his key message was we need to move forward faster. We should have done this some time ago. The key message from Sabine Frank was we urgently need the European Union to clarify the role of carbon removals in terms of the broader policy and also the use that should be allowed and not allowed. And also that governance will be a big challenge for carbon removals going forward. Paolo, I think, could be summarized as saying that we really need certainty on the use. I think a very similar message to what Sabina was saying. And also, we need certainty that people who invest in project financing, that those investments can be safe and can be protected. And from the European Commission, from Alexandre Pacaud, the Commission is open to ideas, open to contributions and support, particularly with regards to the expert group and the development of methodologies for CDR certification. But there is a big challenge around budget, because with the war in Ukraine and all kinds of other economic difficulties, the European Union's budget will be very tight, and therefore finding money for carbon removals will be very difficult. I think I would summarize with my own personal interpretation of the panel is that the debate, which put the spotlight on big unresolved questions like the use of carbon removal credits, good governance, and what can be done to stimulate the market, show why the Carbon Gap Strategy Initiative is so timely and important. So congratulations to Carbon Gap for publishing this very, very important document and kickstarting this debate at this precise time. And I think, to use or abuse my privilege as the rapporteur for the panel, I would say that my key message to the European Union is really that there's a need to accelerate work on a holistic strategy that sends clear market signals to unlock investment in the short term, as well as setting a sustainable long-term framework for what carbon removals does in the longer term. So that's all from me.
Good morning, almost afternoon, I think, everyone. Sam van den Plas, I'm with Carbon Market Watch. We are an NGO here based in Brussels, focusing on fair and effective carbon pricing policies. My panel had a discussion about what's at stake in crediting a future CDR compliance market. The panel was composed of a mix of policymakers, carbon market and carbon removal experts, but I think in total we had several decades of EU ETS policy-making expertise in front of the room. And the panel really helped to create a more nuanced understanding compared to what we saw on the Slido deck this morning, having separate targets versus inclusion of carbon removals in the ETS. The panel took a step back from this dichotomy and looked at purpose and principles behind compliance markets first. So what were they looking at? Cost effectiveness as one key component of that. Markets will seek out your cheapest abatement options throughout the economy and the sectors they cover. That is clearly a benefit, but it's also a risk, because it could mean that markets are too, especially when looking at carbon removals, that they are too strong for their own good, because there is a trade-off between seeking out the lowest cost carbon removals and delivering the highest quality and permanence. One panelist reflected on the negative experience the EU had with allowing about 1.5 billion of CDM and JI credits from the Kyoto Protocol in the EU ETS, which historically contributed to crashing the carbon price. The second aspect which was discussed in detail was environmental integrity. How does this help to deliver and uphold Europe's climate commitments? Impacting the overall cap available in any carbon market is one thing to consider. Also the need to focus on the hard-to-abate sectors. The panel unfortunately did not have time to go into a discussion who is really hard to abate and how much residual emissions do they have and where they sit. A notion was mentioned of the dark side of carbon removals. It was not exactly clarified where they are, but I think somewhere they're hiding in there, and they might be still dependent on production and consumption of fossil fuels specifically. At least that's my take on the dark side, if I may. the need to have safeguards there to uphold environmental integrity, also the need to look at long-term delivery of net negative emission goals and how that sits kind of uncomfortably with a compliance market for CDR was mentioned. All in all, panelists then agreed that markets can be a tool in the climate policy box to deliver carbon removals, but they're definitely not an aim in itself, not a silver bullet to do all that. So then it became really interesting because then the discussion moved away from the ETS-only approach, looking at, for example, the inclusion of carbon removals in the effort-sharing regulation, so setting out national binding targets for delivering carbon removals at the national level. Also, a removal trading system was mentioned as a concept which could add an obligation onto existing EU ETS compliance obligations to deliver a specific amount of carbon removals by the companies covered. Also, the need for dedicated public and private funding came up clearly. Something to be delivered beyond carbon markets approach. Carbon contracts for difference was mentioned specifically. I did not hear a mention of public procurement. I also did not hear specifically the role of the EU ETS Innovation Fund, which generates auctioning revenues to help support such technologies. Definitely worthwhile to consider. In that range of options to consider, I think all in all, the panel's views on including CDR in the European emissions trading system ranged from no, let's not go there, or to not yet. That was kind of the nuances between the discussion. In the meantime, there was broad recognition that this is needed, the support will be needed for CDR. So to retain a signal, to make sure that those technologies can be delivered sooner rather than later. The role of the carbon removal certification framework, recently agreed, came up quite prominently as a testing bed, as a space to see whether things can be developed correctly. And also the importance in the shorter term to separate targets, emission reduction targets from targets for removals was mentioned. I would summarize by saying that the panel broadly supported what is mentioned in Carbon Gap's carbon removal strategy presented here today to deprioritize inclusion of CDR in the European emissions trading system, but be cautious and focus on a wide range of potential alternatives first. And I hope with that I correctly reflected the outcomes of this. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rachel Ardiff, and I'm going to be reporting on the justice-orientated aspect of carbon dioxide removals. So first, it was a really wonderful session, and I'd like to thank Carbon Gap for actually including this in this conference. I think that it is a really not spoken about and not sufficiently considered aspect of carbon removals and potentially of climate change technology in general. So for anyone who missed it, I strongly encourage to watch back on YouTube. I think that the panel had a really good mixture of theoretical and practical considerations. So this came from business perspectives in the Global South. It came from researchers who worked at different levels, and also people who create, or person, Bella, who creates toolboxes for project developers as they attempt to include justice into their carbon dioxide projects. There was a really important distinction between looking at the global level and also community level of justice considerations. What does the global north owe to the global south, and also how do we engage with communities, and how do we ensure that we learn from the people who are most affected? So there was first a consideration of who benefits from carbon dioxide removal, who benefits, who pays, and who gets those resources exported. Price was something that I found particularly interesting. There is a large focus on affordability. I think there can almost be an ideological focus on price. I think this was something that was mentioned by Wim as you look at carbon dioxide removals. And I think that as we focus on making something cheaper and cheaper, you can lose investment in justice. I think that like you consider this in other aspects and other resources, that if you make something cheaper and cheaper, the quality is not going to be as good. So if your only focus in Europe is to make the cheapest carbon dioxide possible, then you are not probably considering justice adequately and considering the people that it most affects. For this reason, there was a scope. The first panel that I attended this morning talked about ensuring that the scope for carbon dioxide removals was kept as broad as possible so that we don't eliminate anything and we allow the market to decide. But there was a call for narrowing the scope for justice's sake, not just to look at the price, but to look at, for example, if we look at afforestation, the plantation-style forests that have been planted in the global south and the effect that this had on the local people. It is very important to narrow the scope of what we consider a sufficient carbon dioxide removal. There was also a large discussion of public participation and procedural justice, so how to ensure that the public are actively listened to, and most importantly, actively listened to the whole way through. Not something that is, like, not that they're only talked to in the very beginning, but 10 years down the line, at the end of the project. Not only for justice aspects and to make sure that marginalized communities get listened to, but also for the wealth of knowledge that's held within the public, for what they know about their own land, and for what they know about what's going to affect them and what's going to work in the long term. Allowances and methods need to be ensured that there is full communication, participation, and education of everyone with whom this affects. I thought a really key and obvious example is things like translators in town halls, to ensure that everyone knows what's going on and that everyone can have a say. Emily also talked about the lack of pseudo voice, to ensure that you are aware of the power dynamics as you go in talking to communities, that you have as a researcher, that you have potentially as someone with a lot of money from from private investment. That you don't put words into people's mouths and that you don't bring them to foregone conclusions, that you make sure that there is genuine participation. There is a need, obviously, there is a need to ramp up CDR as quickly as possible, but there is a need to ensure that there is engagement. These need to be twin priorities and they need to be prioritized the entire way through. There was a discussion of CDR for climate. This is as we moved outside of the community level and looked more on the global level. As you looked at CDR for climate reparations and the importance of looking at the historic responsibility, and I think this ties very nicely back to our keynote speech of what the global North owes the global South. But it needs to be ensured that this cannot be used as a distraction, that we don't talk about what's owed before we even reach the point of peak emissions, that we focus on mitigating what we have now and that we don't talk about reparations for something that we haven't even finished harming. We need to ensure that harm is stopped now. There was talk about the accessibility of language and to ensure that there is education that there's education, but also that justice is helped through things like employment and knowledge of local people on the ground. I think there's lots of reason to be optimistic about the inclusion of justice and CDR going forward. If you look at Justice 40 in the States, where 40% has to be tied back to marginalized community, of the climate justice principles that are installed in EU climate law, we are only at the start of a massive CDR scale-up. We can learn from lessons, both positive and negative, from a variety of projects from around the world. Europe should be a leader and should focus on being a leader not only in green tech, but also in climate justice.
Thank you very much. I hope this was helpful to those to everyone on the panels that they could not attend. And we encourage you to follow them online if you wish to listen to the whole conversation. I think this was a great overview of the key points. I'm very grateful for your conclusions, all four of you. And I would like to conclude this event with final remarks from our very own colleague, Devina Banerjee, who will be taking us on the final words that we would like you to bring home with you.
So I'm now the only thing standing between you and lunch. Thank you so much for coming, and a big thank you to the whole team at Carbon Gap for shaping this event. It's so amazing to see such a diverse group brought together. We've got policymakers, we've got civil society, we've got business, all coming together to discuss the very important topic of CDR scale-up, responsible scale-up in Europe. It's clear that we've had a lot of rich discussions, differing viewpoints, debate, but what is clear is that while we've made a really good start, there's a lot more ground to cover. So we need research and development funding to get much needed solutions off the ground. We need the deployment incentives to get projects to megaton and gigaton scale. We need to think about the long-term deployment trajectory for CDR and how that's embedded into policy. And very importantly, we need to think about justice and social considerations when it comes to carbon removal. Carbon Gap are all here during the lunch break. We really want to hear your views on what you've heard today. So please come and find us. And in the longer term, take a look at our report. Get in touch with us over the coming weeks. We want to discuss what your ideas are and get your viewpoints. And coming all together, let's work towards a comprehensive, ambitious, long-term strategy for Europe. Thanks.